Defending Israel with David Harris is made possible in part by Barbara and Bob Goodkind, the Paul and Lynn Light Family Foundation, To Life, to Love, the Patricia Worthen Ullman Foundation.
Hello JBS viewers, I'm David Harris and welcome back to Defending Israel. Let me share with you an issue. Until about 5 minutes before this recording, we had a guest confirmed, a very special guest, one I wanted to introduce you to. But 5 minutes ago we learned that she was not available. She had gotten the time wrong. And so we've rescheduled her. And here I am. No notes, no ability to think this through, but wanting to spend the next 30 minutes or so with you and not give up this opportunity. So please bear with me. As we meet, President Macron of France is celebrating as now Australia joins Britain and Canada in a group of countries that is pushing improbably right now in the midst of an ongoing war for the recognition of a Palestinian state. The US administration has dismissed the French efforts. The Israeli government has also dismissed the French efforts. But President Macron pushes on, both in diplomacy and through social media. What in the world is going through his head? I mean, on its face, at this moment in time, to talk about unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state seems to me to be the ultimate reward for terror, for corruption, for intransigence, for hostage taking. Is this really the message that Paris, now joined by London, Ottawa, and Canberra, want to send to the world? At this moment in time, when Hamas continues to rule Gaza, continues to hold 50 hostages alive or dead, continues to mock the world by showing images of starving hostages. At this moment in time, this is the right moment to welcome a Palestinian state. And what exactly has been happening on the West Bank in the name of the Palestinian Authority? A Palestinian Authority which continues to pay for slay, as the program is called, meaning to provide stipends to terrorists who kill Israelis, and if the terrorists themselves are shot by Israeli forces, then the terrorist families will receive stipends from Ramallah for eternity. A Palestinian Authority which is now in the 20th year of a 4-year term. So this is the environment in which these so-called enlightened Western countries now want to extend the gift, as I said, the reward of unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state which has no leadership and no defined boundaries, in which the Palestinian Authority leaders themselves, beginning with Mahmoud Abbas, are not even able to travel to Gaza for fear of their lives. After all, the PA was expelled from Gaza after Hamas took over some 20 years ago. So I can only conclude that this is not the result of deep geopolitical analysis of the great minds in those countries sitting together and looking at maps and asking what's best for advancing the prospects for coexistence. No, no, no. This is about domestic pandering. And this is about virtue signaling. The domestic pandering saying we want to win over a big segment of our domestic constituencies, read votes, And we want to virtue signal by seemingly being on the right side of history after all, extending recognition to the so-called but non-existent state of Palestine. It feels right, it feels good, it puts us on the side of the angels, doesn't it? And yet, in reality, it's completely divorced from any common sense, any logic, any understanding of what's going on. Fortunately, in the European Union, there are some other countries who've publicly said, no, this is precisely not the time to do this, and no, we will not join in the efforts. Now, mind you, France, for example, has a complicated history in the Middle East. Until 1967, it was a good friend of the State of Israel, probably Israel's best friend. On the eve of the Six-Day War, President Charles de Gaulle did a 180, turned around and introduced a boycott of French weapons, which could have paralyzed Israel had the Six-Day War gone on much longer. And after that, France became more and more overtly pro-Arab. Take, for example, Osirak, the nuclear reactor being built in Iraq that was destroyed under Menachem Begin's leadership in 1981. Few people know today that Osirak was nicknamed Oshirak after Jacques Chirac, who was then the French prime minister, later president, and who was helping Iraq, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, to build the nuclear reactor, which could have been a threat to the entire region, including, of course, to Israel. And it was only Begin's decisiveness that destroyed that reactor. Fast forward, when there was an effort in the European Union to list Hezbollah as a terror organization, something the EU was very late to address. Eventually, there was some bizarre compromise where Hezbollah was divided into two entities, a so-called political wing and a so-called military wing, and only the so-called military wing was designated by the EU. Why this bizarre bifurcation when other countries like the United States had listed Hezbollah as one single solitary terror organization? Because France, claiming that it had a deeper understanding of the region and especially of Syria and Lebanon, had urged the other EU member states to go along with this travesty. And travesty it was, and travesty it remains after more than a decade. The EU, even today, even after everything known about Hezbollah, including, by the way, terror attacks on French troops over the years, troops stationed in the region, still creates the fiction of a Hezbollah political wing and a Hezbollah military wing. That, too, is thanks to France. Oh, and by the way, even the late Sheikh Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, laughed at this French initiative by saying, in effect, of course we're one organization. We feed off each other. You can't divide us. But the EU did divide because of so-called French insight. And now France brings its latest insight that this is precisely the moment to extend recognition in the midst of a war launched by Hamas that has been supported by the Palestinian Authority. This is the moment to recognize a Palestinian state and to do so in New York at the United Nations General Assembly in September. And meanwhile, while France is, who knows, thinking, smoking, drinking, whatever, the Arab League comes out and publicly says that the war was begun by Hamas, that Hamas has no leadership role to play, that the hostages must be released. So once again, we're seeing more wisdom coming from Israel's neighbors who understand much better the true nature of Hamas and the threat it poses than countries that have the luxury of being hundreds, if not thousands of miles away, and therefore the ability, as I said, to virtue signal and to pretend they're on the side of the angels. But those same countries as well, countries like Egypt, and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain are also the countries that have been telling the West, including not just Europe, but the United States and Canada, stop pretending, stop playing games. You don't know what you're dealing with monstrosities like the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is not a fraternal organization akin to the Jewish B'nai B'rith or to a Greek sorority or fraternity. The Muslim Brotherhood was founded in Egypt just about a century ago, and it has a very clear mission. Its mission is to destroy the nation state in the Arab world and to replace it with an Islamic caliphate. And over time, to go beyond the Arab world into Europe and into the United States and Canada. And it has a century-long project, which was discovered in the 1980s and then the 1990s, to achieve those goals. So our Sunni Arab friends are telling Washington and Ottawa and London and Paris and Berlin and other major capitals, wake up, you're fast asleep, you're in a kind of coma, you're unwilling to understand what we see up close. You call it democracy, freedom of speech, and freedom of assembly. We call it survival, because if it's up to the Muslim Brotherhood, the same way that they killed Anwar Sadat, the Nobel Peace Prize winner for the Israeli-Egyptian Peace Treaty of 1979, and the same way that the Muslim Brotherhood has spawned groups like Hamas, they're coming after you as well. And not only that, but wake up to the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood not only has this century-long regional and global plan, but it has state sponsors as well. Qatar being the best example. It's a very interesting case study. As someone once said to me, in the case of Russia, when Russia faces enemies, its goal is to kill them. But Qatar, when it faces enemies, its goal is to buy them. And we have seen time and time again, we have seen it across Europe, we have seen it across North America, the ability of Qatar, with its bottomless pockets, with $1 trillion, with a T, or more dollars available to it, support this effort to, if you will, forgive the imagery, to kosherize the Muslim Brotherhood, its ideology, to package it in more sort of benign ways in order to make it acceptable. And we're seeing the results. We're seeing the results throughout Europe. We're seeing the results throughout North America. And Qatar is always there with a friendly face and with the assertion that it's only trying to be helpful in the Middle East. It's only trying to bring peace between traditional enemies. It's pro-Western. After all, doesn't it host a U.S. military base? And yet at the same time, there is another more important face to Qatar, and that is its spiritual link to the Muslim Brotherhood, its bottomless pockets, and its determination through extremely clever soft diplomacy, utilizing the best PR agencies from Brussels to Washington, the best law firms from Brussels to Washington, reaching into the American higher education system, into both political parties, into the think tanks, wherever you're looking. And there's Qatar. And most of our politicians to this day are still unwilling to face either the facts about the Muslim Brotherhood, or the facts about Qatar, or the facts about one more country in the region that is also proving to be a state sponsor, and that is President Erdogan's Turkey. Here again, what we're seeing is a series of self-imposed illusions. We want to pretend that Turkey is a friend, a partner, and an ally. Instead, the reality is far more complicated, but again, staring us in the face, not hidden somewhere But in front of us, the Turkey that continues since 1974 to occupy 37% of the island of Cyprus, Cyprus being an EU member. The Turkey that has colonized, I use the word very deliberately, colonized that 30% by bringing settlers from the Turkish mainland into the Turkish-occupied part of Cyprus. The same Turkey that imprisons political opponents. The same Turkey that has continued to repress the rights of the large Kurdish population. The same Turkey that has involved itself so heavily in Syria. The same Turkey that, of course, continues to deny the Armenian genocide of more than a century ago. That Turkey under Erdogan, who has labeled Israel an enemy, who has called for the liberation of Jerusalem, and that Turkey under Erdogan that continues to strut around Europe and North America, believing that it is untouchable, and like Qatar, eventually can make the case that we are friend, not foe, and anyone who opposes us, and we've seen this with Qatar recently, and the work of ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, with which I'm associated, how they're trying to smear a group like ISGAP, because ISGAP has had the courage again and again, and please go visit the ISGAP website, to read the reports on Qatar and Qatar's support for the Muslim Brotherhood and the role Qatar could have played constructively with the hostages and vis-a-vis Hamas while posturing as a negotiator. That all of this is available, and yet there are only a few, like ISGAP, that are taking on these ultra-wealthy, ultra-influential countries and ideologies. And folks, it's time. And we've heard it again and again, as I said, from our friends in the Arab world, both governments and many social media influencers. I recall, for example, going back even 30, 35 years, traveling in the Arab world on behalf of AJC, where I worked for several decades, and being told by Arab leaders, why are you giving sanctuary to our most extreme opponents? Opponents not just of our regimes in the Middle East, but opponents of every Western value. You're giving them sanctuary, believing that you're demonstrating this openness, this democracy, and claiming we have neither openness nor democracy. But what you're really doing is you're engaging in a suicide pact, because they're utilizing the protection you give these extremists in London, in the United States, in Paris. They're utilizing those freedoms to undermine you and to undermine us, your partners and allies in the region. No, we may not be perfect, but would you rather have imperfect friends like us or implacable enemies like the Iranian revolutionary regime of Khamenei? So this is what we're up against. And even as we describe these scenes of Western countries falling on their heads in order to rush to recognize a non-existent Palestinian state, to reward terrorism and hostage-taking and rape and murder and genocidal intent, and even as we are still asleep at the wheel while the Muslim Brotherhood extends its ideology and penetrates both the region and Europe and the United States, and even as we turn a blind eye to the nefarious intentions of putative allies or friends like Turkey and Qatar, once again I look at the pro-Israel community and especially Jewish advocacy organizations, and I want to scream. They're missing the boat in too many cases. They're following the wrong playbook. They haven't fully understood the tectonic shifts that have taken place in our world and that have been revealed especially since October the 7th, nearly 2 years ago. They're still clinging to that old playbook. They still want to believe that If only they have one more interfaith Passover Seder, or host one more iftar dinner, or perhaps host one more inter-ethnic or interracial Thanksgiving event, and make one more gesture of our concern for the human lives of people who want our death, then the world will again like us. This Jewish craving, this Jewish need to be liked at all costs. Jews today need to be respected. And Jews need to understand, at least those Jews who care deeply, not the Jews who are rushing off to endorse Zohran Mamdani, Mr. Globalize the Intifada, but the Jews who care deeply about being Jewish, about the future well-being, safety, security, and prosperity of the state of Israel. Those Jews, they need to wake up. They need to wake up starting yesterday. Yes, this may be the month of August, and it may be a sleepier month, a more restful month, but look around, and everywhere you look, there are more reasons for concern that this extraordinary post-war Western democratic model that was established and that uplifted Jews in so many extraordinary ways and allowed us all to believe that maybe we really had found, let's call it the Pfizer vaccine against anti-Semitism. Its real name was liberal democracy. That in its fullest expression, liberal democracy would protect the Jews. Liberal democracy would allow Jews to feel like equal stakeholders, shareholders, if you will. Liberal democracy would allow Jews to overcome all the previous hurdles and barriers and impediments that were placed before them in every sphere of life, from politics to business, to education, to medicine, to science, to culture. Jews had made it. You could see it. You could see countless examples of this throughout the United States, throughout Canada, throughout Western Europe. We had made it. Sure, anti-Semitism had not completely disappeared, but it had been marginalized. And mainstream societies understood that anti-Semitism was wrong. Anti-Semitism was to be condemned. Anti-Semitism was to be exposed and isolated. And now look what's happening. Anti-Semitism has once again entered the bloodstream, if you will, of Western liberal democratic societies, and in too many cases with far too few consequences. And whether it's a Jewish man in front of his son in Montreal being attacked on the street, caught on camera, whether it's 50 French Jewish children being told to get off a plane from Spain back to France, presumably because they were Jewish, whether it's these free Palestine messages that people are getting on their kosher meals on flights, whatever it is, and we all can cite hundreds and hundreds of examples, unfortunately, in just about every Western democratic country on the planet. I'm not even talking about the non-democratic countries. I'm talking about the democratic countries where we thought the bastion of liberal democracy would protect Jews as it would protect all people, all minorities, and build a better, safer, more inclusive, more open society for everyone, not just for Jews, for everyone, but yes, including Jews. It's beginning to unravel. And as I've said previously on the show, I think of the example of a building that I believe was called Surfside in Florida, where some years ago the buildings board had concerns about the safety of the building and called in building engineers. And the building engineers took a look and said, you've got major cracks in the foundation. If you don't fix them, it's risky. If you do fix them, it's costly. So you choose between the risk and the cost. The buildings board chose the risk rather than face the cost. So they kicked the can down the road, hoping the building would continue to stand and allow them to live there. And as some of you will remember, the building called Surfside collapsed. Some 100 people were killed, and that was all because, despite the warnings, the buildings board decided to wait. Waiting, wishful thinking, hoping are not solutions to the problems that Surfside faced or that we face today in the Jewish and pro-Israel communities. We've been warned time and again, especially in the last 2 years, but even before, there are cracks in the foundation that affect the well-being, the safety, the security, the inclusion of Jews in Western societies. Cracks in the foundation of understanding that Israel is a Western liberal democratic society, and that, like our own societies, deserves to be supported in the face of this barbaric terror that it's facing, a terror which begins with Israel, but certainly doesn't end with Israel. France and Britain and Canada and Australia have already experienced jihadist terror. They want to pretend it's in the rearview mirror. They want to believe, perhaps, that by virtue signaling on a Palestinian state, they'll be exempt in the future. But as I said, at the end of the day, not only are they not exempt, but they're pandering, and they're pandering in the wrong direction, because in pandering, they're undermining their own values, their own beliefs, and ultimately, they're widening the cracks in the foundation of these societies. Jewish organizations, wake up. It's late in the day. Some would say it's too late, but it's never too late. Wake up. Change the playbook. We need much more muscular Jewish organizations. We need much more in the way of lawfare, the way smaller startups like the National Jewish Advocacy Center, the Lawfare Project, the Brandeis Center, and others are showing. We need much more deep forensic research on what's really going on here, not on the surface, but below the surface. The Muslim Brotherhood, who are they? What are their aims in the United States? What's their network in the United States? Where is Qatari funding going? Why isn't it being exposed? What is Turkey up to? Again, ISCAP and the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies have both undertaken a lot of this work. But there's a lot more work to be done, and there are a lot more Jewish organizations who should be participating in this work. We need to hold both political parties accountable. We need to stop giving our votes away cheaply, easily, for free. We need to see that in both political parties today, there are worrisome trends. In the Democratic Party, from a strong red-green alliance that we're seeing from New York to Minnesota to California and to Washington State. In the Republican Party, the increasing assertiveness of people like Marjorie Taylor Greene from the U.S. Congress, Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes, Candace Owens, and others who are challenging mainstream beliefs in the Republican Party, approaching from a neo-isolationist point of view that is strongly, openly, publicly hostile to Israel and to Jews. We need to come to terms. I have a strong belief that, as late in the day as it is, as many as the fractures and fissures may be in the foundation, we're up to the task. We must be up to the task. We've invested so heavily in reaching this point of coming within a few yards of the belief that liberal democracy was the Pfizer vaccine. It's not the time to give up now. It's not the time to succumb to complacency. It's not the time to kick the can down the road and say, well, I'm busy this month and next, but I'll look at it later. And it's not the time for simply robotic support for Jewish organizations because your parents or grandparents supported those organizations. Look at those organizations and ask yourself, not what the output is, but what outcomes they've achieved, real, demonstrable outcomes they've achieved. Together, we'll do it. We'll succeed because, as has been famously said in the case of Israel, Ein brera, we have no choice. We've come this far. Let's be sure that we fix the fissures in the foundation, the cracks in the foundation, lest we wake up one day and discover that the building itself has collapsed. This is David Harris, Defending Israel. Looking forward to seeing you again next week. Bye-bye.